Ilya Ponomarev is a Russian-Ukrainian politician who was a member of the Russian State Duma from 2007 to 2016. After the 2022 Russian invasion, he joined Ukraine's territorial defense forces and categorically denounced the invasion. Ilya, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you back to the channel, but of course,
Thanks for having me, as always.
it's a
Delight.
huge pleasure. It is a concerning time. As we were saying before we hit record, I mean, you've been living in concerning times for longer than the rest of us, but it seems they've taken, a turn for the worse, perhaps, or maybe the better. I'm still waiting for someone to be optimistic on this channel. It hasn't happened yet. Let's just sort of recap because we had the humiliation and abuse of Zelensky in the Oval Office. It now seems that there's been some kind of rapprochement with Trump. What is your impression of this roller coaster of so-called sort of peace negotiations and haggling that is going on?
Well, I think that everything is going on is pretty on in a pretty predictable way. Uh, I was expecting that it would be very turbulent and it would not be very pleasant for everybody, and it is. Sometimes, actually, I think it's too much. Because when, say, US is voting against the Ukrainian resolution in the United Nations, that's to me is too much. No, the rest is plus minus what I have expected, because I think that Trump is an extremely pragmatic personality, and I think that he genuinely wants to reach the peace deal. Uh, uh, he doesn't understand how this peace would look like. And I don't think that his motivation is actually, European security, global security, whatever. I think that his motivation is extremely selfish, is the Nobel Peace Prize, but it doesn't matter. This motivation, in a sense, is even better because that prompts him to act fast and to achieve result. And I think that he is putting all his weight and his energy towards this goal. I think that he is in a very pragmatic mood in terms of that the Ukrainians are willing to negotiate. Ukrainians are willing to go to peace. Kremlin is not that obvious, and that's why he is dancing around Mr. Putin, trying to appease him to get him to the negotiations table. But if we pay close attention, we will see that, despite, again, all the bad things that are being said, and it looks like all the concessions are being set on the Ukrainian side or whatever, none of the sides are taking any obligations in this sense, and nothing is being offered to Russia. And again, if we're looking at the bottom line, the bottom line, okay, so they have this punch match in the White House with Zelensky, but immediately after that, all of the Europe stands up, and the financial allocations for the defense are what we have never seen before, and commitment to Ukraine is not what we have seen before, and a lot of other good things that actually happen. So I am remembering Goethe, Faust. That's the guy. That's the force that always. So say it better in English because I remember
Pact with the
this
devil.
rhyme in Russia. Yeah,
Yeah.
so it's like no, the one which always wants evil, but the one which always does good.
And of course, Putin, or rather Trump, may not have a definite idea where he wants to go or even a clear strategic direction. But of course, we can guarantee that Vladimir Vladimirovich does. He, to my mind, it'd be interesting to hear your point of view on this. Now he thinks that he has, in some sense, neutered the US and has some sort of influence or control over parts of its foreign policy. Surely he will now turn his attention to dismantling NATO and especially the EU as the last bastions of rule of law who adhere to, the old world order, which I'm sure he's committed to dismantling.
Well, look, I think that Putin's influence over the West, over the US, is way, way, way over exaggerated. I don't think that it exists at all. What I think is, and that's very unfortunate, but that's again, this is not something that came totally unexpected, that Putin and Trump, they share the same worldview as world with spheres of influence. I think that's a very natural idea for Trump, that Trump, again, in his pragmatism, is not ready to say that the world is all sphere of influence of the United States. I think that he is more in this Monroe Doctrine that U.S. has its exclusive backyard, which is South America, or both of Americas. That it has certain interests in the Middle East, and elsewhere, but still not all of the world, and that he delegates the responsibility for the security in Europe for Europeans. And he doesn't say that America wants to be involved in this. And if this security in Europe requires a certain arrangement with Putin, that Putin has pretty minor sphere of influence in the understanding of Trump, which is post-Soviet space, and not even full post-Soviet space, because obviously Baltic countries are out of that, and Central Asian countries, they are right now way more under influence of China than of Russia. So who is left? It's Ukraine and Belarus. And so that if Putin wants the sphere of influence, I think that Trump organically is not against this idea. That's the worst thing that we actually see. But at the same time, he doesn't want to repeat Afghanistan's disaster. He doesn't want to look weak. And again, he wants as much as possible, as quickly as possible, to reach a certain ceasefire. And that's the positive thing. So ceasefire, because of that, is very much possible. The long-lasting peace, I have a lot of doubts.
And is that because the two sides are just so far apart? And of course, Putin is making
It's
maximalist
because one
demands.
side.
Yeah.
What's one side?
One
It's not two.
side.
It's one
Yes.
side. It's because of Putin. As soon as Putin would be removed from his office and Putinism destroyed, I don't see that we have any significant problem there.
And that's an interesting question because, of course, Putin has retooled the economy to a military economy. There are hundreds of thousands of Russians who are currently on the front, many who will have severe, mental trauma and issues as well as physical. For the preservation of his regime, surely it's a period of incredible risk if he dismantles that war economy that he's built. And it's also an existential risk if all of those damaged service people were to return home. Does he not need wars? It may not be the sort of full-scale war against Ukraine, but does he not need some kind of expansionist aggression in order to make sure those people don't come back home and threaten his regime?
Yeah, I think that you answer your question by yourself. Indeed, he cannot demobilize the army. Some minor stuff, but not in its entirety. He cannot run the conversion of the military production into a civilian use. He has to continue with the military thing, and again, there is a certain inertia there, which would allow him for a year or 2 years to replenish the stockpiles and stuff like that. But after that, he needs to go to a new war. And I don't think that we need to question ourselves whether he would go to war. I think that the only thing that we should ask each other is where the new war would be. And theoretically, there are only three possible options, which is the Baltic states, so the western flank of Russia, then the northern Caucasus, go to Georgia, once again, or Central Asia. As we understand, Central Asia is under Chinese protection. Putin has already started doing things with Kazakhstan, and we know that China said, it's a no-go. Then with Georgia, I think those guys are very much afraid of this, and that's why Ivanishvili, I don't think that Ivanishvili is just, an FSB agent. I think that Ivanishvili is just a sober, again, very pragmatical businessman who understands that the threat is real. And being a businessman, he's not like Saakashvili, a charismatic fighter, So he wants like hush, hush, we're all yours, just to calm things down and to save his country from the aggression. So I don't think that the aggression would happen there, which leaves us the Baltic states and Poland as the possible targets. And because Putin understands that especially Baltic states are very weak in the military sense. And I think that his calculation is that no Germany or, God forbid, Hungary would be agreed to engage Article 5 of NATO and go at war with Russia because of the Baltic states. I think that's why NATO would be defunct after that. There's no sense to keep the organization if the Article 5 would not be invoked automatically.
And indeed, some of his action and some of the, I would almost call it sort of manipulation of the environment in the US politics, and it's building on sentiment that was already there in some quarters, is for the US to withdraw from NATO. Essentially, rather than challenging Article 5 and not knowing the outcome, you kind of know the outcome already because you've turned NATO into a zombie organization. It seems that he is actually achieving some success in doing that. Then it's up to Britain, France, whether they respond and commit forces to the Baltics and so on. Do you see this kind of provocation happening in the near future, or does Putin need a few years to sort of reset his finances and military, or does this all really depend on whether the US is going to be lifting sanctions against Russia? And it seems there are already signs that some of those secondary sanctions are not going to be enforced, and maybe some of the primary sanctions may be lifted, in fact.
Look, I think that NATO reform, first of all, is long overdue. I think that NATO went to become a zombie organization, not with Trump's accession to power. Actually, I think that nobody did like Trump to revive NATO, to actually resurrect it from the dead. And that's what we see right now with all the discussions that are happening in Europe, with all these extraordinary summits where the US is not invited. That's to me is a revival of NATO. But I think that the NATO essentially went dead in 1992. Because it was at that time when the construct that was put on its foundation started not making sense anymore. It was all assumed that it would be a global confrontation between US and Soviet Union, so Russia, and that United States extends its nuclear umbrella over Europe, basically to prevent the war to come to US territory, so to make Europe the battleground, but to extend its security guarantees and protection. It's no longer the case because we are, even with Putin in office, we are not talking about a global nuclear confrontation. We are talking about these spheres of influence and everything, but it needs to be redone completely. And I think that the new NATO would actually start from Eastern Europe. I think the union between Ukraine, Poland, and the Baltic states is the new NATO. Poland is the country which has the most capable army in Europe, in European Union, and Ukraine is just the largest and the most capable army on the continent. And the combination of these two actually gives the possibility to create a real defensive umbrella. And if Americans are to withdraw, that's even better because it gives NATO a moment of clarity and eliminates any remaining illusions. And actually, in the history, it was already like this. Who are Kazakhs? Kazakhs are those mercenaries which were recruited by many countries for the military purposes, and I think that's the direction we are heading to at the moment.
And of course, that's what Ukraine needs is genuine security guarantees, isn't it? Ones that aren't just based on little pieces of paper, but which involve genuine force. And it has been announced that France and Britain will be putting together a so-called peacekeeping force of up to 10,000, and they would have the remit to fire back if fired upon. So far, though, that's not necessarily a force that has any kind of deterrence power with Putin. I mean, 10,000 is not a huge number compared to the scale of the war that's being unfolding. What would you hope and expect to see from Europe if it's going to create a genuine sphere of influence and a genuine security architecture in Europe?
That's exactly what I was saying. So I expect that Europe better start paying Ukrainian army for both the technologies and the manpower. So Ukrainians have right now 1 million people. Poles have 300,000. The rest way less. Ukrainians have unparalleled military technologies, which are battleground tested, which emerged in the last 3 years. And just for you to understand the statistics, 85% of casualties on the Russian side are being caused by application of drones technologies by Ukraine. 85%. So it's not HIMARS, it's not ATACMS, it's not Abrams or Leopards. It's not even artillery anymore. So artillery is important, but it's not as important as it was even in 2022. So it's all about drones at the moment. And that's a really disruptive technology because it's cheap and even Baltic states can afford to build defenses which are adequate to the aggression force coming from the east within the budgets that they can theoretically afford. But that requires Ukrainians doing this. So if we have this alliance on the eastern flank, from Romania to Finland, to build a new defenses and to create a new quick, rapid response forces, that's what can be done as soon as ceasefire is reached.
Now, you've written that you think that Putin is genuinely looking for some kind of ceasefire, even if he cannot get the conditions, the maximalist conditions he's demanding kind of agreed. Is that because of the pressure in the Russian economy? Is that because he feels he's got enough to sell it as a win, for instance, at the Victory Day on May 9th? Or will he be playing games, running manipulations, provocations, things that might actually almost amount to a kind of slap in the face for Trump? What do you expect to see up until that kind of May 9th and a potential sort of signing of a ceasefire at least?
Well, I think that we need to separate two totally different things: ceasefire and the peace agreement. These are different things. The ceasefire is not about conditions. I think there are some, but they're rather procedural conditions than like any kind of like ultimate arrangement. So Putin wants to make sure that after the ceasefire, Ukraine would engage the elections. That's what he genuinely wants, and there is a very strong reason for this, because that would make Ukrainians fight to each other. There would be internal competition. The country would become weaker. There would be a big internal turmoil, and most importantly, it's a certain period of time, 3 to 4 months of the election campaign, during which Putin would have a possibility to negotiate with the United States on different matters, not Ukrainian matters, but nuclear proliferation, START treaty, Arctics, Middle East. And with this, they can build a certain trust, and eventually that would lead to those spheres of influence. So because if there are all these other tracks where the arrangements are made, then the US can say, okay, so then like Ukraine is yours. Yes. So, and that's, I think that's what he is betting on. Whether he would be successful, it's a big question mark. But nevertheless, ceasefire is as useful for Putin as for everybody else, and that's why I think it would be reached. The only thing that was preventing it was actually presence of Ukrainian forces in the Kursk region, and if they would be pushed out, then the last obstacle that existed on the way to ceasefire would be eliminated. Now, a peace agreement, that's a totally different story. Because that's really where sides need to make concessions. And Putin, at the end of the day, he needs to be able to declare victory. And if this peace agreement would be along the current front line, it's not like it is a victory, because that means that everybody understands that Putin was unable to conquer even Donbass. Not speaking about the other regions, but even in Donbass, he didn't score. So it's all an unfinished deed, and that's why I see absolutely no chance for a long-lasting peace deal to be reached. Maybe if they would come to some grand territorial exchange, and I know that such option in general is on the table, when Ukrainians give up the remainder of Donbass, but they will receive Zaporizhia and Kherson in return, then it would be closer at least to this more permanent solution. But I think it's not so likely.
And of course, he'd probably demand Luhansk as well, which he doesn't possess in its entirety, but does have some of
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. The
function in
Donbass,
there.
it's a tiny portion of
Yeah.
Luhansk region, which is still free under Ukrainian control, and it's almost 30% of Donbass region, which is also still free.
Well, we'll turn back to Kursk and whether it met its objectives in a minute, but I wanted to turn to something you said earlier, which fascinates me, the idea that Putinism will die with Putin. But you have these other figures like Karaganov, Malafeyev, Patrushev, and others. You have extreme nationalist forces. Are these guys going to be swept aside when Putin goes, or is there a real risk that Russia's next regime will be a sort of extreme kind of theocratic, nationalistic kind of regime?
Look, all these guys, they're chameleons. And under Yeltsin, it was the same Karaganov, Malafeyev, and all others. And the same Karaganov was the most pro-Western guy that I know in Yeltsin's foreign policy establishment. And other people like Nikonov, like
Medvedev and all of them.
the same Lavrov. Yeah, Medvedev was the face of pro-Western changes in Russia, in the change of course. Now it's the largest hardliner you can imagine. No, these guys, they have no spine. They don't carry any ideology with them. It's a matter of their personal survival. They're conformists, so they really doesn't matter. Such people, we need to get out of power as far as possible. But that, those who were part of the war crimes, like Medvedev, they need to be punished. But most of them, let them do business, let them enjoy their private life, just get them out of touch with the state management. I'm speaking about the regime. The system is very personalistic. It's many observers, they call it Bonapartist regime, and I think it's an accurate description. Such regimes, they do not survive when the central figure in the regime dies or resigns or goes away somehow. And I think that would be the case as well, because Putin destroyed all the institutions in the country. He even destroyed the institution of the presidency, which was brilliantly illustrated by the same Medvedev. Medvedev was the president, but he had no power, the power where the Putin was. Putin is the institute and the only remaining institute. There is no parliament, no government, no presidency, no courts, no army, no nothing. Yeah, the atmosphere in general, it would not be easy, and how to build a new system, and that's why I think that we should do it together with the West, and that's what focus of Congress of People's Deputies, which I have the honor of chairing, Shadow Russian Parliament. That's where what we focused on is in creating the new statehood, in the new constitution, the new rules of the game, the new system. That's where I think that we should concentrate our efforts, and not in some other short-term things. But actually, the biggest prerequisite for Putin's reign to end is if he would be unable to wage a new war, and that's why we need to work a lot in ensuring security of the Baltic states and other eastern countries of European Union, and work on the alternative so that when Putin leaves, we have something to replace him with.
That's a very important point. Well, we'll sort of end on that question there. What can Europe do? What can Britain and France especially do to deter Putin from further aggression? I mean, Poland is rearming and it has the highest proportion of its GDP actually going on defense. They seem to be taking that threat incredibly seriously. But what further should Europe be doing now that it seems maybe you'll disagree. It seems that Europe is finally waking up from its deep, long slumber.
I fully agree. It looks like it's happening. It should not be just money. It should be smart money. I think that we should spend a lot on the technology transfer from Ukraine to the rest of Europe. I think that everybody should learn from the lessons of this war. I think that this money should be spent a lot to reinforce the eastern flank of NATO. And still, we should remember that the peace is possible only after the regime change in Russia. So at least a tiny portion of this money needs to be invested in the regime change and in the construction of the new regime and the new legitimacy, the new structure, the new political layout of the future Russia.
And Ukraine is central to European peace, but also potentially central as a template for future democratic progress in Russia, perhaps as well.
100% agree with this, 100%. That's where everything can be incubated and then sent towards Russia.
Ilya, it's always a tremendous pleasure and, of course, an honor to be able to speak with you on the channel. Today, of course, is no exception. And I think your insights are very gratefully received by the audience of the channel. So thank you so much for joining us again and good luck with the work that you're doing.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's my pleasure always.